right. There we go. Well, thank you everyone for joining. And this is the first of our sessions for the new Rector's Bible Study. So I appreciate those of you who are joining us live today in person, but then also those of you who will watch this later in the week when the recording goes out with the newsletter. And I hope you'll be able to participate in either fashion going forward. And if you are someone that's only able to watch after the fact, I would love your feedback. So if you have thoughts, comments that kind of percolate up as you listen to the recording, as you read the Bible yourself, it would be lovely to receive that feedback if you want to email me, and we can include some of those comments each week as we move forward. So this week in particular is just our introduction to the series, and we're going to spend some time talking about the plan for the year moving forward, and then also do some brief introduction to what it is that we are engaging with, what our Bible is, where it has come from, and how we understand what we do with the biblical text. So I'm going to begin with the kind of nuts and bolts of the plan for what we are doing moving forward. So I want to spend a moment just talking about kind of the calendar and what that looks like, but then also sort of how each session will go. So I am going to go ahead, let me remove my pen, and then I'm going to share the screen here. Okay, there we go. All right. So this is a calendar that is currently private. It is set to my personal Bible study calendar that I have developed. However, this week I'm going to be working with Mike to transfer this over into the parish calendar so that each week at 10 a.m. you can go to the calendar that's on the website, see Bible study listed, and when you click on that event, it will show you what we are reading for that week. I have established the Bible study readings through the end of Easter. So going basically into the beginning of May. I'm leaving things kind of unfinished at that point because I don't quite yet know what my schedule will look like for the second half of 2026. And I also don't know exactly what's going to be going on in our parish life. And so I want to have a little bit of space for some flexibility because you'll notice that there are certain weeks where we're not meeting because of big programming in the life of the church. So, for example, we are meeting today on the 3rd, and this will be our introduction to the series. Next week, on the 10th, we'll read Genesis chapters 1 through 25, and then on the 17th, Genesis chapters 25 through 50. So essentially, this month, we will get through the book of Genesis. But then you see that we are not meeting on either Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve. So the next time that we will gather will be on the 7th of January when we'll begin Exodus. And then, as we go forward, you'll see, we have a course mapped out in front of us. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we'll be reading each week. But you might reasonably assume at the outset that that's a substantial amount of material that we will be covering each week, because the goal is to read through the entire Bible in a year. Now, I will admit to you all, as I've not quite finished the second half in 2026, that my goal is to begin us with this first Sunday in Advent, but we might end up going through to the calendar year end of 2026 in order to be able to read the whole Bible through. So it might be more like a 13-month read through of the Bible instead of a 12-month read through of the Bible. But we will, our goal and our objective is to read through the entire Bible from now until the end of 2026. Yes, Pam.
So we should read these chapters before we meet on the 10th.
Yes, that would be the goal. So each
Okay.
week, those chapters are the chapters that will be covered.
Okay.
So that's a perfect segue then into how these sessions are going to be formatted. And it speaks a little bit to what it means for us to read the Bible and how we read it. So one of the things that I just want to spend a few moments talking to you all about is how I was shaped and formed in terms of engagement with the Bible. I've mentioned before I was raised in an evangelical tradition where the primary focus was what you hear in Scripture, how God is presently speaking to you in Scripture. And there was certainly, especially in more, uh, um, for lack of a better term, academically oriented churches or churches that did formation in a kind of deeper and more robust fashion, there was certainly an awareness of what the Bible was historically, where the context was in which these Bible books were written, and understanding kind of where they came from. But there was always very much this emphasis on the personal experience. What is God presently saying to you in the Bible? Um, there are other traditions, other ways of encountering the text, and as I've shared too, I was from an early age very kind of closely connected to or aware of the Roman Catholic tradition, and there is a more common way of engaging the Bible in which you're reading it for its historical value, you're understanding the sits and leben, the setting in life in which the Bible was written. You're understanding a lot of what we would call the historical critical elements, but you're also engaging with the tradition of the church. What did the early church fathers say about this book? What did the medieval scholars say about it? What did Thomas Aquinas say about it? Or Saint Dominic? What did the great teachers of the church say about these texts? And so there is a kind of spiritualized component, but it's often through the lens of how you are being connected to deep scholars and deep thinkers of the church. And so there's more of an emphasis on the received tradition, the received wisdom of the centuries of people praying over and contemplating and deeply engaging with these texts. In the Roman Catholic tradition, there's not a complete divorcing, though, of individual engagement. In the Benedictine tradition, there's this beautiful practice of what is called Lectio Divina, which is a very prescribed way of reading the Bible. You take a text and you actually read it through 3 times, and each time you're asking a different question. So you read it through and you sort of identify one set of questions in the first reading, identify a second set of questions in the second reading, identify a third set of questions in the third reading. And so that's sort of drawing again out of what is my personal experience and where am I encountering God's presence in this text in this way. But there are just different models for reading the biblical canon. And then there are completely secular ways with biblical scholars who are not coming from any kind of faith perspective. And they're simply asking, what does this say as a historical document? Who were these people? What were they writing? Why were they writing it in this way? And so all of these are different ways of reading the Bible in a specific form. I was trained at a time in my seminary that the biblical scholars were exclusively, every single one of our Bible teachers at Virginia Seminary when I was there were trained through the Yale University program. So they all had their PhDs from Yale. And in the middle of the 20th century, there was uh, uh, a process of biblical scholarship that became known as the Yale School. And it is a narratively based approach to doing biblical scholarship. And what I mean by that is that the fundamental kind of lens through which we think about the Bible is as a narrative of God's relationship to his creation and our relationship as created order back to God, and how we understand the development of that relationship through covenant, through story, through the centuries of engagement that we've had with God. And so there's an element of the historical that is very important in that. Who were the people that God was speaking to in a given time, in a given place? What were the cultural elements of their life? What were the things that shaped and formed how they experienced God in that moment? The nature of the relationship that God had with them in that moment. And how do we understand culturally what is going on with them that shapes how they talk about their engagement with God? So all of those elements of historicity are very important because they inform how we understand what is being said. But inasmuch as that's going on, we too are present day people with a present day relationship to God. So, what is the text saying to us as a narrative today? How are we as a people of faith journeying with our God in our own day, with our own relationship, our own narrative of how God is working? And so, both of those things are simultaneously important. It's not that we privilege one over the other, but we hold both simultaneously. And so the goal of this course is going to be, and for me, to do something very similar with us. And that comes to a very practical element in terms of how this series is going to be organized week in and week out. Because the first half of every week, the first 30 minutes or so, will be largely me kind of giving some information about what we have read, identifying some of the scholarly elements of what we hear, offering some teaching so that we have kind of a deeper engagement with understanding where this particular part of the Bible came from. But then the second half is going to be more of a personal reflection. And for those of you who are listening to this after the fact as a recording, you'll notice that most weeks the recording will only be about 30 minutes, because what we will do is end the recorded piece at the end of each kind of teaching element, so that the personal reflective piece can be more of a shared experience of those who are gathered. And as I said, if you are watching this after the fact, but you have something you would like to offer to the group, I would invite you to email those comments or questions, because I want to make sure that we give space for your participation as well. In any of the kind of rote questions, if you have sort of detailed informational questions about specific historical events, we'll keep that in the recording so that people have an opportunity to hear those questions and answers. But then the more kind of personal piece, what was called out of me when I read these chapters, what of these chapters really spoke to me? We'll be covering quite a bit of material each week. And so it very well may be that, we have four of us today that are here gathered, that all four of us connect with a different piece of what we're reading. And I want to be able to have time to share that, and share that in a way where it's not going to be kind of preserved into eternity, but have some kind of personal ability to share with each other. So each week the recording will be about 30 minutes, and then we'll have, for those of us who are participating in the immediacy of the Bible study, some time for personal reflection as well. So that kind of concludes this sort of outline of what we're doing. I want to shift for a moment and talk about kind of how we proceed forward. And I'm going to do kind of two things for the remainder of our time today. I'm going to identify some kind of just basic concrete elements of what Bible should I use, how should I read it, etc. Um, and then we're going to watch in a few moments a video that just kind of gives an example of one way that we begin to sort of approach and think about these issues, especially as the question of where did the Bible come from? How do we have the Bible we have? And there's a wonderful short video series from Yale with two scholars, one an Old Testament scholar and one a New Testament scholar, who interview each other about how the canon developed. They're very short, 12 minutes for one, 14 for the other. But we'll start today with the one about where the Old Testament canon came from, what we would call as Christians the Old Testament canon, and understand just kind of what it is that we are going to be reading in the coming months ahead. So those will be the two kind of remaining things that we'll do today. So I want to start with what Bibles we read and how we read the Bible. So if this is a very kind of matter of fact statement, but I just want to draw our attention to the what are called the canons and constitutions of the Episcopal Church. This is the driest, most boring document that you will ever encounter. It is literally the legalism of our church. It is all of the rules, all of the regulations by which we conduct ourselves as a denomination. And we actually have rules about what kind of Bibles we can use for worship. So I'm just going to read through this very quickly, but it just gives you an example of some of the books, some of the translations of the Bible that are authorized for use in our tradition. So it says, the lessons prescribed in the Book of Common Prayer shall be read from the translation of the Holy Scriptures, commonly known as the King James or Authorized Version, which is the historic Bible of this church, together with the marginal readings authorized for use by the General Convention of 1901, or from one of the three translations known as revised versions, including the English revision of 1881, the American revision of 1901, and the Revised Standard Version of 1952. From the Jerusalem Bible of 1966, from the New English Bible with the Apocrypha of 1970, or from the 1976 Good News Bible, today's English version, or from the New American Bible 1970, or from the Revised Standard Version, an ecumenical edition commonly known as the RSV Common Bible of 1973, or the New International Version, or from the New Jerusalem Bible, or from the Revised English Bible, or from the New Revised Standard Version, or from the Contemporary English Version, or from the Contemporary English Version Global, or from the Common English Bible, or from the Revised New Jerusalem Bible, or from translations authorized by the diocesan bishop of those approved versions published in any other language, or from other versions of the Bible, including those in languages other than English, which shall be authorized by diocesan bishops for specific use in congregations or ministries within their diocese. So you see, there is a huge variety of different translations that are allowed to be used in our church. But I want to point out the lessons prescribed in the Book of Common Prayer shall be read. So this is for liturgical use. It's not that we as private Episcopalians are limited in our own devotional practices to these translations. It's whenever we gather for public worship, we have to use one of these translations. So my encouragement to you is to find a Bible that feels approachable, one that you feel like you can read and read easily and read in a way that's going to keep you engaged. There are people, my grandfather, for example, who would always read the Bible every year all the way through from the King James Version. I have attempted that at least 5 different times in my life. And at some point, my eyes gloss over and I'm just not able to do it. It's still a goal, it's still a bucket list item, but it's just so difficult for me to be in that headspace. And so the more modern translations are always the ones that I go to. And I want to talk about that for just a moment. So, can you all let me stop sharing for a second so you all can see me again? And let me pin, uh, there we go. So if you're really, really in the weeds, you might actually read the Bible in its original language. So for the Old Testament, that would be the Hebrew scripture. And this is actually in Hebrew, and I'm actually holding it incorrectly. Hebrew is read from right to left, and so the Bible actually begins on the back page, what we would think of as the back page, and goes forward. And it's in Hebrew. And I have colleagues. I have unfortunately never developed my skills well enough to sit here and be able to do this with complete fluency. But you can sit and read the Bible in the Hebrew, or for the New Testament text to read it in the Greek. And this is the Greek New Testament. What I will commonly use, and you can find this both in the Greek and in the Hebrew, this is a Hebrew version, is called an interlinear. And what that means is that it has, and I don't know that you all can see this, but it has the Hebrew, and then underneath it has a literal translation of the Hebrew. So you see every single Hebrew word translated into English. And what the difficulty of using this as a liturgical text, even as a devotional text, is that because it's a literal translation, it is written, the English is exactly how the Hebrew is written. And so, any of you who have studied foreign languages, you'll know that the sentence construction and the grammar is not the same in English as it is in a different language. And so you have to kind of read it and understand, okay, this is how Hebrew sentences are constructed. And so, I have to put this word over here and do this and that to understand, what's being said. But it's really helpful because it helps me identify, if I'm looking at a specific word, why is it being used here? And where else might I find that same concept or that same word in the Bible? And so that's another example of a text that you might use. And then there are the majority of English translations that are essentially developed by committee. And so this is the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. This is what we use liturgically. So every week when we have our readings in worship, we're using the New Revised Standard Version. There are other examples. So this is actually what's called a comparative Bible. And I kind of like these too. Especially if you're wanting to kind of understand how different English translations work. So this one in particular is the New International Version, the King James Version, the New American Standard, and the Amplified. And Amplified is one of a group of Bibles that are written idiomatically. So the emphasis is on readability, not on scholarly accuracy. And so you might be remember from the 1970s, the Living Bible. It was very, very popular. It's a paraphrase. So they're looking at the overall, like let's say sentence or paragraph, and they're saying, how can we idiomatically easily communicate what's being said so that it feels approachable to people who are reading it? Instead of saying, okay, we want to make sure that what we're translating is going to be as close to the original as possible, as scholarly accurate as possible. So you have these paraphrase versions. That's the Amplified. And then the others that are just different eras of scholarly translation. But for this Bible, for example, you have, and it's very small print, but you have all four translations laid out side by side.
Wow.
So that you can see, even in an English translation, how different translations vary in the way in which they're translating the Bible. And that's the majority, as I say, these sort of committee translations where you have different scholars working together to create the translation they're using. And then every so often, you'll have an individual scholar. Usually it's not the whole Bible, it's a part of the Bible, who takes on a project of translating the Bible themselves. So the Eastern Orthodox scholar, David Bentley Hart, who's actually originally from Ellicott City, so he's relatively local, grew up in the Episcopal Church, so he's someone that I appreciate very much. He has written his own translation, or I should say he has compiled his own translation of the New Testament. And this is just him working by himself. So it's not a committee of people. It's how he goes through the Greek and his individual choices as to how he translates things. One of the things that you will discover, and this is less true with the Hebrew scripture, but with the New Testament in the Greek, we have a plethora of early manuscripts. Remember, until the printing press and Gutenberg, we don't have a reliable way of transcribing a text and preserving it in a singular form that is going to preserve that specific form in perpetuity. So from the earliest years of the Bible through the medieval period, you have scribes who are by hand replicating the text. And as any of you can imagine, when you have someone transcribing something by hand in that way, you're going to begin to have variations that pop up. You know, your mind begins to wander and you accidentally put the wrong word down or whatever. And so what you'll discover is that these manuscripts have variations. And so sometimes the debates in translating are not just how do we translate this word and what are the different options for translating this word into something that's going to as closely mirror the intent as we can discern it of the author, but also we have 5 different manuscripts that have 5 different versions of this verse. Which one of those verses are we going to go with? How are we going to determine which choice we make? And so when you have a committee, they sit down and they work all of this out and they figure it out and they make their determination. With an individual scholar, they're doing the same thing, but they're kind of making their own determination. David's work as a individual scholar was to try to create something that was fairly academically rigorous. There was another biblical scholar of sorts. He was actually more of a literary figure who, and I'm blanking on Eugene, I think it's Eugene Peterson. Let me just grab this Bible real quick. But he translated in the 90s a version of the New Testament called The Message. And some of you may remember The Message. It got quite a bit of press when Eugene Peterson, when it was first translated. And Eugene had a background in English, as sort of writing and composition. And The Message was written again as a kind of paraphrase version of the New Testament with this intent to be very readable, almost like a narrative story that we would encounter. So you have all sorts of different ways of reading the biblical text, just in terms of what you choose. So again, my emphasis for you all and my encouragement to you all is that you find a version, no matter if it's a paraphrase or an exact translation, a scholarly version, or a more kind of approachable common English. Anytime you see common, it's going to be written in a way that's sort of an easier reading level, a more approachable reading level. Any of those are going to work for the purposes of our Bible study. My goal is to get us to read the Bible more regularly, and to read it through over the course of this year. So whatever you need to do to kind of do that, I encourage you to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again because I want to show you some options. If you are someone like me who sometimes hits, I just want to show you too, there's a great online resource. If I can get, let me move this out of the way. There we go. There's a great online resource called Bible Gateway that actually has a ton of different translations, even non-English translations. And so you could go through if you're wanting to look at a specific passage or a specific verse and you want to say, okay, well, how is that being translated in different ways at different times? You can go through and select those. It's a great, great resource for online stuff. But what I was going to say is if you're like me and sometimes you hit a wall in terms of being able to sit and read something for hours on end, there are some excellent audio options. So if any of you have Audible, there are some wonderful translations on Audible that you can get through your Audible account. Or if you're wanting to do, and I highly encourage just in general for you all to take advantage of this if you do, if you're in Montgomery County or if you're in Frederick County, either one, there are some excellent digital resources offered through your public library. The one that I want to highlight for you all, both for written like ebooks, but then also audiobooks, is this Overdrive/Libby. And it's an app that you can download on your phone or on your iPad, and you put in your library account number, and you're able then to download ebooks or audiobooks. If you download an ebook, if you have a Kindle reader, most of the ebooks will actually interface with Kindle. So even though it's a library book that you have on loan, you can send it to your Kindle and read it from your Kindle. It's really, really nice. But then Overdrive/Libby and Hoopla both have audiobook versions of the Bible that you can, again, borrow and download and then be able to listen. The one challenge to this that I will just highlight is that you only ever get, your audiobook for a certain, just like any library book, you get it for a certain period of time, usually about 2 weeks, and then it returns. So it's not something that is easy to kind of keep all the time. But if you're going on a drive and you want an audiobook version for a week while you're on the road, it's a great option for that sort of thing. And like I said, both Frederick County and Montgomery County have both Hoopla and Libby, Libby/Overdrive. So highly encourage those as options as well. But sometimes just having an audiobook version that you can pop in and listen to while you're doing other things can be really, really nice. So all of those are ways in which you can read the Bible. Now, reading it as you're thinking about it, I'm going to show you some of the resources I'm going to be drawing from, but there may be times and maybe opportunities you have where you really want to kind of deepen your investigation on a certain issue. Maybe it's something that goes beyond what we're able to cover in the course of the hour that we have together. So I'm going to show you just a couple of different examples of resources. I have a lot of them here in my personal library, in my office. I'm always happy to lend stuff out if there's something that you say, hey, I want to look up or I want to read more about. I'd be happy to help you kind of find something. So there are general kind of overview books that are really nice to have. So this is the one that we used in my seminary course on the Old Testament. It's written by Michael D. Coogan, and it's called The Old Testament. And it's sort of a textbook, but because it's a textbook, it's general enough that it's nice because you get a good overview. And it goes through and it has, explanations about how Genesis was formed, what the narrative elements are, some of the historical critical elements, what was going on at that point in the Middle East, culturally, etc. And so that's a really good text. And then you've heard me reference him many times in sermons. Raymond Brown, who is now passed on, but he was a Roman Catholic scholar, and the preeminent, even to this day, still the preeminent New Testament scholar. And he has this wonderful introduction to the New Testament, and it. Again, it can be scholarly at times. He sort of identifies here are some of the major debates about this section of the New Testament and hear what different scholars say. But it's really nice because it's one book and it takes you through the entire New Testament and kind of gives you some of the major scholarly information to help deepen and enrich in your reading of the Bible. So those are what are called sort of surveys of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Then you'll have series. The Anchor Bible is a very, very highly regarded one that's called a commentary series. And in a commentary series, you'll have different scholars who will be contracted by the series editors, in this case, the Anchor Bible series, to write an entire book about a book of the Bible. So, for example, and sometimes it's even more. So this is one good example of the Anchor Bible series where it's just the middle part of the Psalms. It's Psalms 51 through 100. They actually contracted multiple scholars to do different parts of the Psalms. And so this is one entire book just about Psalms 51 through 100. And this is one entire book just about the Gospel of Mark. And so you get, the surveys kind of give you the broad brushstrokes, but these really get into the very kind of nitty gritty, in the weeds, very detailed information about each and every verse and all of the different information about that. And then you have, yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Are those like how things are interpreted?
Yes, so that's a great question. So different commentary series will have different focal points. Anchor has generally tried to kind of cover everything. So it's not only interpretation, it's also, what was the nature of the composition? What do we know historically about who the author was, how they developed this particular this particular passage. For example, when you get into the epistles, the Pauline epistles, for example, were a very specific form of Greek writing. And so it will be not only who was Paul, what was Paul saying to this community, but why did he choose to use this specific literary form in writing that letter? So it gets into, and then you take on top of that, okay, well, the epistle to the Ephesians has this translation in this manuscript, or this language in this manuscript. It has this language in that manuscript. What are the variations in the text, and how did scholars decide to choose one version of it over another? Or maybe it's continued to be an unsettled question. And so why is that an ongoing debate? And what are, usually the scholar who's writing that commentary will say, this is my opinion on it. Here's the landscape of the debate, and here's what I think is most compelling. So it kind of covers all of that. So that's why they are entire books, because they really do everything together. And then there are just some other general resources, and this really, really gets into the detail, but I think it's good to know what these are. So you have something called a lexicon, which is actually kind of a word key. So you can say, okay, I've come across this particular word, and I want to know how often it occurs
Oh.
in the Bible. Where else is this word used so that I can see other places where this concept is being talked about or developed? And that can help you with that. There are dictionaries that give you, so these are, all in English. It's not the keyword search, but it can say, what does pneumatology mean? I hear this term pneumatology brought up. What does that mean? How do we define it? What does it mean in terms of understanding the work of the Holy Spirit? And you can look up individual words and kind of understand their definition. And then there are multiple series, that are like, I have an entire encyclopedia where you can look up a concept. What is an epistle? We hear this term, and it will have a whole article about what the epistolary form in Greek writing was, what a letter consisted of, how it was structured, all of that. So, you just like any encyclopedia, you could find entries for different concepts. And then you have different series. This is an Oxford Companion by Bruce Metzger, who's another major leading New Testament scholar. But it's basically, one kind of cohesive book that just is sort of a companion guide to walking alongside a reading of the Bible. So there are just a whole lot of different resources out there. I'm just kind of quickly giving you an overview of them to get a sense of what you might choose to use as we continue on in this process.
Brother John, I have a
Yes,
question.
go ahead.
If you wanted to look, I assume all these books are at the library, or maybe not specific libraries, but if you wanted to find that book on Psalms 2,
Yes.
how would you find the anchor?
Yeah, excellent question. So I always start with Amazon, to be honest. I see if it's on Amazon, because usually that is the most expedient way to locate it. There's also, let me just pull this up. Nope, wrong thing here. Let me share
While you pause, Chris, you can use Wonder Book and Video there in Frederick too. They have a great resource, and you just, you order it and have them delivered to the Wonder Book and Video store right there in Frederick, and it could cost you $3 or $4 total for the whole book.
Oh, interesting. But I was just curious, if you look for the anchor.
Yep.
Where you start.
Yeah.
Trying to find one of those.
So let me that
Did
is.
you go to anchorpublishing.com?
But if I just put in Psalms 2,
Yeah.
I don't think I'd bring up that book. I don't know. Maybe I would.
Oh, that's not the WorldCat I'm looking for. Let's just Google. It's .org. So if you go to worldcat.org, don't do worldcat.com like I just did. But let's say, okay, you want to find I need to move this again. You want to find the anchor, let's say the Anchor Bible Psalms, and you don't have to have it specific, but Psalms 2. So you search that, and then interesting.
You didn't spell anchor correctly.
Yeah.
That's why I didn't find it.
Thank you. Usually it's not so fickle. There we go. So yep. So here's an example. So this is Psalms 1, but what you can do is you can find, okay, it's located this book, and then you can scroll down. That is very frustrating. I guess that they have now put this behind a paywall. That is very disappointing. So historically, let me do some investigating over this next week.
It says there's one edition in one library.
Yes, but it won't show you what it is.
Oh.
Because it's behind. Oh, here we go. This Our Lady. Oh, that's in Nebraska. That's obviously not correct, because I know they have this at Virginia Seminary. But it used to be that you could go here to WorldCat, look up an item, and it would tell you all of the local libraries that it would be in.
I see.
But it appears that this is no longer the case. So let me do some investigating on that front.
But they have it at Abe Books, right?
Where do you see that?
On the right. Buy this item.
Oh, yeah. So there you go. So, yep, and you can find, so it does show you where it is in different, on different online vendors. So, yep, exactly.
Okay.
Okay. I want to end us, because we're just going to go slightly over since we began a little bit late today. I am going to play a short video. It's about 12 minutes long, but this will sort of set us up for next week. And it's beginning to transition into that last part of today's presentation about what is the Old Testament canon that we are going to be reading, and how do we begin to think about what we have received. I want to just say at the outset that this particular video is very, again, you're going to hear me use this term a lot, historical critical. That's a school of thought that is most singularly focused, or most primarily focused on the development as a historical document, as a historical artifact, not so much a spiritualized who are we as people of faith reading this, but where it comes from as a historical element of our history as humankind. But I think it's nevertheless helpful to kind of understand a little bit about what the Bible is that we are going to be interacting with. So I'm going to play this video and then we'll talk about it briefly.
Just real quick, I have an appointment 11:30, so I'm dashing out at 11.
Yep, no worries.
Don't think I'm not angry or anything.
Okay, thanks.
So we're going to talk about how the Bible came to be formed in this conversation. And, Protestant and Catholic folk have different Old Testaments, right? How did that come about, and how did we get an Old Testament in the first place?
Well, let's start with how we got a Hebrew Bible in the first case. Now, in the book of Exodus, there is a passage in Exodus 24 that refers to the book of the covenant. And people take this to mean Exodus chapters 20 to 24. So you could say this would be the first occurrence of an authoritative book. It has 10 commandments, it has some other more specific laws, but it isn't by any means a Bible as we would understand it. It doesn't have that kind of scope, which is maybe the beginning of it. Another step would have been in the book of Deuteronomy. There's a story told in the book of Kings, how the book of the law was found in the temple. But the way that's applied, it only seems to affect a couple of things, mainly the centralization of the cult.
And when did that discovery take place?
This would have been in 621 BCE. So it's a long time after Moses. Stuff has been germinating for, 600 years at this point. But it's really after Deuteronomy that this gets worked up into a more substantial collection of laws. Now, the crucial moment, I think, in the formation of some kind of an authoritative book like this comes with Ezra in the Persian period, usually dated to the year 458. At this time, Judah was a province, if it even had that status in the Persian Empire, very much a backwater. And as the story goes, Ezra went to the king and said, I would like to go and see if they're observing the law properly in Judah. And he had the book of the law that was in his hand. And people figured that this was some version of the Pentateuch or the Torah. Not quite the final one, but the important thing was, the Persian king seems to have said, all right, this is your law, this can be the law for Judah.
So that would have included things like the sacrificial system of Leviticus and all the laws of Ashru.
It would, yeah. They didn't have all the calendar right. They didn't have the Day of Atonement in the right place yet. but they were very much concerned. It was largely a combination of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and they must have had some of the stories in there too. But from that time forward, the Torah of Moses, or the law of Moses, was the ancestral law of Judah. Now,
So this is from the middle of the 5th century.
5th century. Now, they probably continue to refine it. Exactly how closely they observed it is a whole other question, but it had that status. When the Greeks, the Syrians, took over in Jerusalem, Antiochus III issued a proclamation saying, you may live according to your ancestral law.
And that would have been
In 198 BCE. 30 years later, when Antiochus Epiphanes had some difficulty with the people of Judah, he suspended the right to live according to their ancestral law, and that set off the Maccabean revolt. But that's really where the idea of the law as fundamental comes from, I think. They come back to that. Now, besides that, you had other kinds of writings floating around. So you had all these books, sayings of the prophets.
Isaiah and Ezekiel and
Yes,
Jeremiah.
and these all claim to be inspired. They typically began, this is the word of the Lord. Now, did people believe every time a prophet said this is the word of the Lord? Well, probably not. But one of the things about these books that got preserved is that nearly all of them predicted the destruction of either Samaria or Jerusalem. And it happened.
Samaria was destroyed
In 721 or 22, and Jerusalem in 586.
AD.
And I think Jeremiah,
BC.
Okay.
had fought with other prophets in his whole time because he was saying, you're going down. And it did go down. And at that point, I think people sat up and said, we better hold on to these.
That
There's
prophet knew something.
Yes, that prophet knew something. But as you were saying about Jesus saying on divorce, they didn't just preserve what they had, they added to it. And if a prophet didn't say something they thought he should have said, they elaborated that. And so by the time you get finished with the sayings of Jeremiah, it's a very long book. And we don't know really how much of it may have come from Jeremiah. But in any case, this is how you got a collection of prophets.
So that collecting and that expansion of prophetic sayings is happening in the 5th, 4th
In
centuries.
the 5th, 4th, 3rd century, but say by the 2nd century, it seems to have been pretty much complete. One of the things that people point to is the book of Daniel, which is ranked with the prophets in the Christian Bible, is not included with the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. But the obvious explanation is that they had already more or less closed their collection of prophets. Now, there may have been other prophetic books out there, but this collection seems to have had some status, and it seems to have had that by the beginning of the 2nd century.
And that collection probably includes the big three and then the 12 minor.
And then the 12. Yeah. But Daniel didn't make it into the Hebrew. But then there were other writings, and these included things like Proverbs. Now, there's a case to be made, I think, that the book, the kind of material that you have in the book of Proverbs was the original curriculum for scribal education in ancient Israel. That is what they would teach people so they could learn how to write and learn a little ethics in the process. Now that, was material that people were attached to, and so that got preserved. And now Proverbs doesn't make any claim to be inspired. The Psalms make no claim to be inspired. These are human utterances. Yeah. Well, there may be a couple in there that are written by David, but you'd find, with the things we found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that you have the corpus of these. There were more Psalms floating around in the 2nd century. That part of the canon wasn't finished or closed probably until the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, after the second destruction of Jerusalem. It's at that time that you begin to get statements that the formally approved writings are either 22 or 24 books.
You have something in Josephus.
You have that in Josephus, in his tract against Apion, and you have it in 4th Ezra, which is written about 100 AD. So by then, they were getting things nailed down. But By then, Judaism had spread. Now, there were a lot of books out there. The Dead Sea Scrolls brought to light a lot of books that we never knew existed. But there were also books that were translated into Greek or were written in Greek, and some of these were valued by communities, especially outside of Judah or Judea. Now, these would include things like the Wisdom of Solomon, which is in the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Bible. The Greek collection of scriptures has several books that aren't in the Hebrew. And that then would become actually...
Maccabean histories, for
Now,
instance.
the Maccabean histories, that's an interesting one, because First Maccabees was surely written in Hebrew. It is a nationalistic Jewish text, and it is one of the great ironies that that's preserved as canonical by the Catholic Church, not by Judaism. My guess is the rabbis didn't like something about the Maccabees. The Maccabees may have taken too much authority into themselves.
So say a little bit then about Catholic and Protestant Bibles. Does it have something to do with this phenomenon of translation?
Well, it does, because you see, there was a creeping edge to the canon. And at any point, there was always what I'd call a penumbra on the borders of the canon of books that were more or less canonical, and that there would be some disagreement as to whether they were in or out. The book of Ben Sira, also known as Ecclesiasticus, written in Hebrew in the early 2nd century, probably before the book of Daniel.
2nd century BC.
Yeah, before the book of Daniel, wasn't included. My best guess is it wasn't included because he signed his name to it. So, and by then they thought that all really important stuff must be old. Daniel got in because this was thought to be the prophecies of Daniel back a few hundred years earlier. Yeah. So that was
pretty clear that was written in the 2nd century.
Very clear. Yeah. So you have that. You have the books of Maccabees. You have books like Tobit, Judith, Baruch. These are what we call the deuterocanonical books, because the Catholic Church formally accepted them as part of the Old Testament, but it did that at the Council of Trent.
But they were in the Latin Bibles of the Catholic Church,
They were
right?
in the Latin Bibles. But now you see, if you go to the manuscripts of the Greek translations of the Bible, no two of them will have exactly the same collection of writings. And so you may have 151st Psalm. You may be missing Esther, as you sometimes are. You will have things like the Psalms of Solomon that nobody nowadays accepts as canonical. But in the manuscripts, this was a rolling corpus. So you always got the Pentateuch, you always got the major prophets and the 12 minor prophets, and then the last category always remained fuzzy. And it remained fuzzy again, then a little bit differently in the Latin Bible. And so this was rolling along fine until the Reformers came along, and Jerome actually, who translated the Bible into Latin, he held to the Hebraica Veritas, which is, if it's not in Hebrew, it's not real. And
But the principle then came to be applied.
But nonetheless, he translated the other books, and translated some of them badly. It's generally agreed that he rushed it. But they were there. And so then Luther went back to the principle of the Hebrew authority. So he threw out things like the Wisdom of Solomon and Ben Sira. Wisdom of Solomon, to my mind, is a great book, actually. It is a very interesting book. But this was the principle that went into it. Whereas then the Catholic Church came along and said, well, in that case, we are going to include.
And that was the Council of Trent,
the Council of
in
Trent,
the 16th century.
in the 16th century. So really, the decisions that determined what's in your Bible were made in the 16th century.
Well, that
even those weren't quite final, because nowadays, if you go to a Protestant church, you can very well find a New Oxford Bible with the Apocrypha. And what Protestants call the Apocrypha are generally what Catholics call the Deuterocanonical. which is to say canonical, but not quite at the first rank. That there's a recognition that these are kind of secondary.
Well, that answers my question. Thank you very much.
All right.
So they're all in both books, but in
Yep.
separate sections?
Yeah. So let's, okay.
Show your daughter how much you love her
Sorry
with this
about that.
beautiful
Hold
gift.
on just a minute.
It
Where do I-
says, to my daughter, never forget that I love.
Okay. Were you able to hear that okay, Tim?
Yeah, it was fine. It was a
Okay.
little soft. I turned the volume up on my laptop and I could hear it fine.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, very good, very good. Yeah. So the question, and I wanted to sort of leave us with this for today because this is something that's sort of unique to the Anglican tradition. You heard at the very end that the majority of Protestant traditions did not hold any kind of official status for the books of this sort of ambiguous order, the things that were not originally written in Hebrew, that were these additional canonical texts floating around in the last years before Christ, and then in the first century or so after Christ's birth and death and resurrection. And so, as the canon, even in the Hebrew tradition, is being kind of concretized and solidified, you have these debates, in our own tradition. So as the Anglican tradition is forming and organizing, we, as we very often do, try to say both things at the same time. So as we begin to engage with the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament as we would receive them or call them, I just want to point our attention to what is referred to as the 39 Articles. This is part of the historical documents section in the back of the prayer book. It's in all of our modern prayer books. This is just a kind of funny thing. So these were developed in the early years of the Anglican tradition by folks who were very Reformed, which means that they were very influenced by John Calvin and the Reformed tradition that was developing in Switzerland. So they were very, very Protestant. And you can tell that. Let me scroll down past this piece real quick. Where is it? So there are 39 of these, and I love the, let's see, is it the 20th? No. There is the sacraments.
The 20th did mention Holy Writ.
Yes. There is a, here, let me find it real quick. Anyway, there's one of the articles, and I'm not immediately finding it, but it states explicitly that the Bishop of Rome is to have no jurisdiction over the Church of in England. It also those you may know that there is a tradition in the Roman Catholic Church of venerating the sacrament. And you'll notice in this article, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper was not by Christ's ordinance reserved, carried about, or lifted up, or worshipped. So this is a very Protestant. This is a very Protestant document. But even in the 39 articles, and this is really what I wanted to draw our attention to, we have what they refer to as the canonical books of the Bible. And these are all of the things that we just heard them talking about. Chronicles, Kings, the books of Samuel, the 12 minor prophets, the 4 major prophets, the Psalms, Proverbs. I mean, all of these that we are typically familiar with. However, I wanted to show you, and this, again, this is the very Protestant end of the Anglican tradition, yet they are even saying, and the other books, as Hieronymus saith, the church doth read for example of life and instruction of manners, but yet doth it not apply them to establish any doctrine. Such are these following: the 3rd and 4th book of Esdras, the book of Tobias, the book of Judith, the rest of the book of Esther, the book of wisdom, Jesus the son of Sirach, Baruch the prophet, the songs of the 3 children, the Maccabees texts, Bel and the dragon. And so these are what would be referred to as those apocryphal or deuterocanonical books. So you might hear sometimes that Protestants don't read these books. They don't consider them canon. And because of our unique location as the Anglican tradition, we do kind of have this status, this secondary status of them. So as we read, this is exclusively a matter for our reading of the Old Testament. We will be reading those books as part of our engagement with the Bible as well. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. But I want to kind of end us there today and wrap things up. But are there any final questions or comments that any of you have?
Well, I'm just a little confused about that. So do both of the Bibles, the Catholic version and the Protestant, include all of the same books, but show these as a separate section in each of the books?
Excellent question. So most modern Bibles, because they are being marketed to as wide of an audience as they can be, are going to usually set them aside in some way where they are demarcating them.
Some say including Apocrypha.
Right, including Apocrypha. And what they will do is they will have them as and this is the New Oxford Annotated Study Bible. It will have them as a section that falls between the end of the minor prophets, Malachi, and the beginning of Matthew. And so they'll sort of be this middle section in the Bible set off by themselves.
In the Catholic?
No.
Also?
I was saying in most general Bibles today, that's what you'll find.
Oh.
However, what the Catholic tradition does is it integrates those texts where they would fall kind of in the sequence of how the Old Testament develops. So the wisdom literature is included in the wisdom literature section with the Psalms, Proverbs, etc.
Gotcha.
So it just depends on what Bible you're encountering. Most Bibles today, because they're trying to be marketed to everyone, will set them aside. So even you'll find Catholics that have Bibles where they're offset.
Really?
Even if they're not. I'm not saying that that's a Catholic company producing it. I'm just saying you'll have Catholic individual Catholics who will have a Bible with them offset. But if you're getting a Bible from a Catholic publisher, they'll usually be integrated in the sequence of where you find them.
So in some Bibles, you'll have them, but they all are going to have the same books unless they don't include the Apocrypha.
Correct, unless they don't. So, for example, the comparative one that I was showing earlier is specifically a Protestant company. Zondervan is, I don't know if they still are, but historically they were the publishing wing of the Southern Baptist Convention, I believe, or they had a very close connection to the Southern Baptist Convention. So none of the versions that they include here, that's not going to include it at all. They're just going to be completely absent.
Oh,
no reference to the apocryphal deuterocanonical books whatsoever.
so the book
So-
of Tobit
Was,
is
yeah,
not
just
in there.
does not
Got it.
exist in
Gotcha.
here. Yeah, or Judith or
Yeah.
Maccabees exam.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are some versions. So you'll notice, some versions of the Bible, even versions that are authorized in the Episcopal Church, like the NIV, never translated the apocryphal or deuterocanonical texts. They're just completely absent from that translation of the
Gotcha.
Bible.
Thank you.
So, and one thing, this is not exactly true. I want to caveat this slightly, but by and large, one of the ways that we have mediated that in the Episcopal Church is that you will encounter the apocryphal or deuterocanonical readings in the daily office, but not in Sunday worship. So it is very rare that we actually have one of the deuterocanonical texts in a Sunday lectionary reading. They will almost exclusively be found in the daily office readings. So,
Thank you.
yeah. All right, Tim, any further questions?
I have one. When you were talking about resources earlier, does Anchor Publishing just kind of have a list of all the books they've commissioned and had published?
Yes.
So if you want to see if they have a book exists on
Yep.
some book in the Bible, you can find it from their site.
Yep.
Because that seemed like a pretty good resource, a place to start most cases. So that's why I'm asking.
Yep. Let me. Yeah, and Anchor is affiliated with Yale, so it's part of Yale's publishing house. But if you go, you can just go to Yale University Press. This is their link for this specific Bible series. So it gives you, they have a Bible dictionary that they published. They have a reference library with other volumes. It says 50 volumes on a variety of different elements of biblical scholarship. Okay. And then you have the actual commentary itself. And when you click on the commentary, then you can see, here are all of the different ones. And one of the things that they do is the Anchor Bible, and this is true of most of the major commentary series, they are not static. So they will have, for example, I think, let's see, I'm going to go, yeah. So you'll notice, for example, that they have just produced a new Judges 13 through 21 because scholarship develops over time. So, I think they first started publishing in like the 1940s or 1950s. And, certainly there are commentaries that are now outdated because new information has come to light. And so they have new scholars come back and rewrite that commentary and they publish it again. So you'll have different generations of the commentary series as well. So, but yep. But yeah, the Anchor, if you just go to Anchor Bible Publishing, you'll find all of their resources online. And a lot of those too, I know people sometimes don't have the warmest and fuzziest feelings about Amazon, but if you do have a digital reader like a Kindle, a lot of those texts are available in ebook form for a more reasonable price as well. Yeah. So,
when you were saying what we were going to discuss today,
yes,
one of the last things you said was how to read it.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, I addressed that earlier, but I'm happy to go back to that. So I do not have a concrete, definitive answer to that because for me, I value and lift up your own method or mechanism that works most appropriately for you. So for me, I'll just speak personally that I have found the Benedictine tradition of Lectio Divina to be the most helpful way for me to read. which is this set process of reading it through 3 different times with a series of questions. The first is sort of what, for me, and there are different sort of models for Lectio, but one of the ways that I'm reading it is what is the immediate response that I have? That's my first reading through. What is a key word or a key phrase that immediately stood out to me in reading this? And then the second read through, what am I hearing of the original author? What am I seeing in how how God might have been communicating to them? Is there anything that sort of historically speaks to me? And then I read it through a third time, and the question I always ask is, what is the modern application? Not just what speaks to me personally, but what do I sense as a sort of societal message or a larger cultural message, a larger world message that I'm reading. So I read through the same piece 3 different times, asking 3 different questions. And different Lectio models will have different questions that they're asking of you. And then there are ways of reading that can be more oriented towards, what does the tradition, and I don't have a version here, but there are versions of the Bible, especially the Eastern Orthodox, our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters have a number of versions that are really, really nice like this, where they'll actually, they'll have a chapter of the Bible, and then alongside, in parallel, they'll have quotations from the early church fathers that say, St. John Chrysostom said this about Genesis 2, or St. Ignatius of Antioch said this about chapter 3 of Genesis. And so you can read it and then have a companion with a scholar of the church who is offering their take on what you're reading. So that's another model. So I just encourage you and experiment too. Try doing a different variety of ways of reading. And I'm happy next week to provide maybe some examples of that, so that you can kind of nice. Experiment with how to read and see what connects with you. So
thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Chris. And thanks everyone who's watching this after the fact. And we'll see you next week. Take care.